Good evening, everyone. In this series of our lectures, we are discussing another poet, William Butler Yeats, who was born in 1865 and died in 1939. Yeats was Anglo-Irish poet. He belonged to a Protestant family, a fact of importance in 19th century Ireland, where patriotism was so bound up with Roman Catholicism. Means at that time, Roman Catholicism in Ireland was at peak, but Yeats belonged to a Protestant family. His father was an eminent painter. Yeats spent his boyhood between school in London and his mother's native country of Sligo, a wild and beautiful country in the northwestern Ireland, which is the background to much of his poetry. His youth was passed during the upsurge of the Irish political nationalism represented by the Home Rule movement led by Parnell. He shared the antagonism felt by English writers of pre-Raphaelite background, notably William Morris, to the urban and industrial harshness and materialism of contemporary English culture. He saw a basis for resistance to it in the Irish peasant folk tradition and ancient Celtic myth. His first work was on a theme from this mythology, the wanderings of Oisin. Yeats was indeed fortunate in having such a cultural basis at hand for his anti-materialist poetry, while his English contemporaries had further look. His career is divided naturally into four phases. First phase falls between 1889 to 1899. During this period, he was a leading member of the aesthetic movement in London, an outcome of pre-Raphaelitism. Means to say, aesthetic movement was an outcome of pre-Raphaelitism, but especially indebted to the Oxford scholar Walter Pater. In its revolt against Victorian materialism, aesthetic movement tended to Catholicism and to mysticism. Its meeting place was the Rhymers Club and its public voice, the Yellow Books. It shared its mystical sympathies, which in his case brought together Celtic and Indian mythology. These come out in his work of the period. In the prose, The Celtic Twilight appeared in 1893, The Secret Rose, The Tables of the Law, The Adoration of the Magi appeared in 1897, Verses were Crossways 1889, The Rose 1893, The Wind Among the Reeds came in 1899, and his verse play was The Countess Kathleen that appeared in 1892, and The Land of Heart's Desire appeared in 1894. His career's phase 2 spans from 1899 to 1909. In the second phase, Yeats, with the help of Lady Gregory, built up the Irish National Theatre, which found a home in the Abbey Theatre, Dublin. Until 1909, he was its manager and he wrote plays for it, predominantly based on Irish myths. The period was disillusioning for him so far as his hopes for Irish culture went, but it was formative in his development as a major poet. He hoped to make the theatre the voice of a distinctively Irish modern culture, and at least he succeeded in creating one of the most interesting dramatic movements in contemporary Europe. In personal terms, the theatre business brought out new strengths and realism in his character and in his writing. He was the first poet writing in English since 17th century to seek intelligently and purposefully for an effective dramatic idiom and for new methods of dramatic production. His only volume of works during these 10 years was The Seven Woods, came in 1904. Amongst his plays are Kathleen of Holohan, 1902, The King's Threshold, appeared in 1904, Deirdre, 1907. Phase 3 falls between 1910 to 1908, the period of transition. It was the period of transition in his career. He had begun his career in the tradition of Spenser, Shelley, and the Pre-Raphaelites, and he had always been interested in the mysticism of William Blake. But he now became one of the poets, including Ezra Pound, whom he met at this time, and Thomas Dunn Eliot, drawn to the intellectually vigorous tradition associated with the 17th century metaphysical poets, especially John Donne. He was no longer a romantic, at least in the decadent sense of a dreamer, but though his mood was harsher and he had lost some of his faith, he searched no less assiduously for symbols which could give meaning to history and life. At first, he turned away from Ireland, but the Irish Rebellion of 1916 turned him back to his country, Ireland, which was, after all, the human context of his emotions. His books, The Green Helmet, 1910, and Responsibilities, 1914, represent the new austerity of his poetry. Phase 4 is called the Great Period, that spans between 1919 to 1939. It is in this that Yeats grows into one of the very finest poets in English literature. Means, in the fourth phase of his career, William Butler Yeats became very important poet in English literature. His great books are Wild Swans at Cowley, appeared 1919, Michael Roberts and the Dancer, 1919, The Tower, 1928, and The Winding Stair, appeared in 1933. This work is marked by strong rhythms, by stanzas and rhyme patterns, which enforce thought, by severe diction, with few adjectives, and by a range of symbols, each of which is a nucleus of meanings. The symbols are part of an elaborate theory of history explained in the prose, A Vision, written by Yeats himself. Yeats himself wrote A Vision, derived from the Italian philosopher Vico, and this philosopher Vico lived between 1668 to 1744, and it was also affected by Neoplatonism of Plotinus that belonged to 3rd century AD. Whatever the faultiness of system is considered, apart from the poetry, it is constituted for Yeats' mythology, which he could use poetically to embody human experience widely and deeply. It is scarcely helpful to try to learn this mythology, means the mythology that Yeats used in his works, in order to understand its poetry. Yeats' poetry, it is illustrated by the poetry itself if it is read in bulk. And with these symbols, the tower, the moon, etc., Yeats had a wide mythology of persons, and these mythologies were sometimes drawn from his own friend, sometimes from history and myth, and some of the mythologies were invented. For example, Crazy Jane in words for music. Perhaps this like a woman young and old, a full moon in March. The last poems has more bitterness and less richness than the previous volumes of his great period. Yeats continued to write plays and to improve his dramatic diction, dramatic idiom, partly under the influence of the Japanese no drama. His best play is nearly his last, and these are Purgatory, 1939. After 1910, Yeats' prose is also distinguished, notably his autobiographies that appeared in 1915 and 1922, Some of his critical essays, for example, Per Amica Silentia, appeared 1918, and his essays on drama, plays and controversies, 1923, are important. So, friends, this is all about William Butler Yeats. So, keep reading, and we will meet in our next lecture on another important writer. Till then, bye bye.